not the silence of peace, the silence of shock. Jerusalem, the loudest city in the ancient world during Passover, with more than 300,000 pilgrims squeezed inside walls that normally sheltered 40,000. This city woke up on Saturday without a voice. On Friday, the sun darkened for 3 hours in the middle of the day. The earth shook. The temple veil, a linen and purple curtain 18 meters high and the thickness of a human hand, tore from top to bottom without anyone touching it. Tombs opened, and by late afternoon, a man whom thousands believed to be the promised Messiah was dead, hastily wrapped in a linen sheet and locked inside a borrowed tomb carved into the rock. When the sun rose on Saturday, no one knew what to do. The disciples were in hiding. The women were destroyed. The priests were paranoid. The Roman soldiers were confused. And inside that tomb, sealed with a stone weighing nearly 2 tons, the body of Jesus of Nazareth lay motionless in the dark. But here is what no one tells you about this day. Holy Saturday, the day between the cross and the empty tomb, is the most forgotten day in Christian history. Everyone knows Friday, everyone celebrates Sunday, but Saturday is a void. And it is exactly in this void that one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire Bible takes place. Because while Jesus' body was still in that tomb, something was happening in a dimension that human eyes cannot see. Meanwhile, on the outside, every group of people in that city, disciples, priests, soldiers, women, pilgrims, was living the worst day of their lives, each for completely different reasons. What happened during those hours? What was heard in the streets? What was felt inside those locked rooms where grown men cried in fear? And what was happening in the invisible world, in the depths while Jerusalem slept? To understand this day, you must first understand the night before. Because Holy Saturday does not begin on Saturday morning, it begins on Friday at sunset. In the Jewish calendar, the day does not start at midnight like ours. It begins when the sun disappears on the horizon. This means that the exact moment Jesus died, around 3 in the afternoon on Friday as Matthew and Mark record, started a race against time. There were only 3 hours left until sunset. 3 hours to remove a body from a Roman cross, negotiate with a governor, prepare a burial and seal a tomb. All of this before the Sabbath began and any work became forbidden. And it was not just any Sabbath, it was the Sabbath during Pesach, the Jewish Passover, the holiest day within the holiest week of the year. Any violation of the rules of rest on this specific day was not just a sin, it was a public scandal, a ritual impurity that would contaminate not only the person, but their entire family. Joseph of Arimathea knew this. This man, a member of the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Council that had condemned Jesus hours earlier, did something that put his reputation, his political position, and possibly his life at risk. He went to Pontius Pilate and asked for the body. Think of the absurdity of this. A member of the court that condemned the defendant now asks for the body to give him a dignified burial. Mark uses a specific Greek word, tolmesis, which means having taken courage. It was not a casual request. Joseph needed to gather courage because he knew that from that moment on he would be marked. The same colleagues who voted for Jesus' death would see that Joseph was honoring the body. There was no going back. Pilate was surprised, not by the request, but by the speed. Roman crucifixion was designed to be slow. Some crucified men took 2 or 3 days to die. Jesus died in approximately 6 hours. Pilate called the centurion in charge and confirmed, yes, the prisoner was already dead. Only then did he release the body. Now imagine the scene. The sun is already low, the golden light of Jerusalem's fading. Joseph and Nicodemus, another secret member of Jesus' followers, the one who once visited Jesus at night so as not to be seen, carry nearly 34 kilograms of myrrh and aloes. 34 kilograms. John records the exact number. This is an absurd amount, worthy of a royal funeral. For context, when Herod the Great was buried decades earlier, the amount of spices used was described as enormous, but historians estimate it was not much more than what Joseph and Nicodemus brought for Jesus. They took the body down from the cross, pierced hands, lacerated feet, side open by the Roman soldier's spear. The linen sheet, called a sindon in Greek, was spread over a stone surface, and the body was placed upon it. There was no time for full preparation. In a normal Jewish burial, the body would be washed thoroughly, anointed with oils, and each part would be wrapped in linen strips with spices between the layers. This process took hours. They did not have hours. They had minutes. What they did was an emergency burial. They spread the spices around the body, wrapped the sheet, and placed a separate shroud over the face, as was the custom. Then they rolled the stone. And here enters a detail that most people do not realize. That stone was not just any rock leaned against the entrance. First-century Jewish tombs in Jerusalem used a system called a golel, a circular stone that slid in an inclined track carved into the rock. The stone was positioned at a higher point, and when released, it rolled down until it sealed the entrance. Pushing that stone back up required the effort of several men. Archaeologists who have excavated tombs from this era in Jerusalem found closing stones that weighed between 1 and 2 tons. It was not something a single person could move. The tomb was sealed, the sun disappeared, the Sabbath began, and Jerusalem plunged into a type of silence that the city did not know. Now let us enter this city, because to understand what Holy Saturday meant for every person involved, you must first visualize Jerusalem at that specific moment in history. We are in the spring of 33 AD. Most historians and chronologists point to April 3rd as the date of the crucifixion, which places Holy Saturday on April 4th. Jerusalem during Passover was a transformed city. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish Roman historian who wrote decades later, records that during Pesach, the population of Jerusalem exploded. In one specific count, he reports 256,500 lambs were sacrificed in a single Passover. Since each lamb fed a minimum group of 10 people, we are talking about more than 2.5 million people in and around the city. Even if Josephus exaggerated, as ancient historians often did, archaeological numbers suggest the city received at least between 300,000 and 500,000 pilgrims. Imagine what that meant physically. Jerusalem, in the 1st century, occupied an area of approximately 1 square kilometer inside the walls. Put 300,000 people inside that space, and you have a density greater than any modern city during the worst rush hour. Every flat roof became a campsite. Tents covered the slopes of the Mount of Olives. Families slept in the temple courtyards. The Kidron Valley, between the city and the mount, turned into a makeshift city of leather and linen tents. And all these people had seen or heard what happened on Friday, the darkness that covered the land in the middle of the day, the earthquake, the rumors about the torn temple veil, the public execution of 3 men on Golgotha, which was right next to the main entrance road to the city, positioned there on purpose by the Romans so that everyone entering or leaving would see the price of defying Rome. If you believe this level of historical detail changes how you see the Bible, comment, "I did not know." Now, when the sun rose on that Saturday, the city was divided into completely different groups, each living their own nightmare. To understand the day, we need to enter the mind of each one of them. Let us start with those who were most destroyed, the disciples. Luke preserves a phrase that is perhaps the most devastating in the entire New Testament. 2 disciples walking to Emmaus after everything said, "We were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. We were hoping." Past tense. Hope had died along with the body on the cross. But that phrase was said on Sunday. On Saturday, the situation was even worse, because on Saturday they did not even have the emotional distance of a full day to process what happened. They were in a state of raw shock, John gives us the physical setting. They were gathered in a room with the doors locked for fear of the Jews. This verse describes Sunday, but the situation on Saturday was identical or worse. Think of the scene, a room on the upper floor of a house in Jerusalem, probably the same room where they had celebrated the Last Supper 2 days before. The same space where Jesus had washed their feet, where he had broken bread and said, "This is my body." Now that room was a hiding place. The table where they had eaten together was still there. The floor where Jesus knelt to wash feet was still the same floor. Every object in that room was a stab in the memory. There were 11 men. Judas was already dead, having hanged himself on Friday, as Matthew 27:5 records. 11 men who had abandoned everything, families, jobs, cities, to follow someone they believed to be the Messiah. And now that someone was dead, not dead like a heroic martyr who fell in battle, dead like a criminal, hanging naked on a Roman cross between two thieves. The most humiliating form of execution the ancient world ever invented. And the worst part, they had fled. Every one of them. Mark is brutally direct. They all abandoned him and fled. Peter, who hours before had sworn he would die with Jesus, denied knowing him 3 times before the rooster crowed. The weight of guilt in that room must have been suffocating. It was not just grief. It was grief mixed with shame. The most toxic combination the human mind can endure. What did these men do on that Saturday? The honest answer is probably nothing. Traumatic shock paralyzes. Modern psychology recognizes that in the first 24 to 48 hours after a severe trauma, the brain enters a state of protective numbness. Emotions become dulled. The body functions on autopilot. A person eats without feeling hunger, breathes without noticing, looks without seeing. 11 men sitting in that room, in silence, unable to formulate what happened, unable to imagine what will come next. Because think of their practical situation. They had dropped everything. Peter was a fisherman. His boat had probably already been sold or given to someone else. Matthew was a tax collector. His post had been filled the day after he left. They had nowhere to go back to. The movement to which they had dedicated their lives had just been publicly executed. And they were the known accomplices of the executed man. At any moment, the same machine that killed Jesus could come looking for them. But there was a group even more devastated than the 11. A group history often forgets when telling this part. The women. Mary, Jesus' mother, had watched her son die. Not from afar, up close. John places her at the foot of the cross. She saw the nails. She heard the screams. She watched the agonizing breaths for hours as her son's body fought against the asphyxiation that crucifixion causes. 33 years earlier, an old man named Simeon had held the baby Jesus in the temple and said to Mary, "A sword will pierce your own soul." Luke 2:35. On that Friday the sword went through, and along with Mary were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, and other women who had followed Jesus from Galilee. Luke 23:55-56 gives us a crucial detail about what these women did between the crucifixion and Saturday. They went to the tomb, saw how the body was placed, went back home, and prepared spices and perfumes to complete the burial that Joseph and Nicodemus did not have time to finish. And then, Luke records with almost painful precision, they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. They rested. According to the commandment. The obedience of these women is heartbreaking. They had the spices ready. They had seen that the body was not prepared properly. Every fiber of their being wanted to go to that tomb and care for the body of the man they loved. But the Sabbath said, "Stop." And they stopped. Imagine Mary Magdalene on that Saturday morning, the woman from whom Jesus had cast out 7 demons, as Luke 8:2 records. The woman who had found in Jesus a reason to live after years of torment, sitting in some corner of Jerusalem with jars of myrrh and aloes by her side, looking out the window at a day that would not end, counting the hours until Saturday's sunset, when the Sabbath would end and she could finally go to that tomb and do the only thing she could still do for him, prepare his body for eternity. But she did not know what awaited her there. Meanwhile, on the other side of Jerusalem, a very different group was also having a terrible night. And the reason for their insomnia was not grief, it was fear. Matthew 27:62-66 describes a scene that happened on Saturday morning, and it is one of the most revealing passages in the entire Passion account. The chief priests and the Pharisees, the same ones who had demanded the crucifixion, went to Pilate on the Sabbath, the day when no devout Jew should do any work, much less go to the palace of a pagan governor. The fact that they went shows the level of desperation, and what they said to Pilate is extraordinary. "Sir, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again. Therefore, give orders that the tomb be secured until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal him away and say to the people, he has risen from the dead.'" Stop and absorb what is happening here. Jesus' enemies remembered the promise of resurrection. The disciples, the ones who walked with him for 3 years, who heard this promise repeatedly, forgot, or they did not believe it, or they were too traumatized to connect the dots. But the priests remembered, and they were terrified, not terrified because they believed Jesus was going to rise, terrified because they knew his disciples could steal the body and claim he rose, and that, in their minds, would be worse than everything. Matthew records the exact words, "The last deception will be worse than the first." The first deception, in their view, was Jesus declaring himself Messiah. The last would be a false resurrection that would give the movement unstoppable force. Pilate responded with typical Roman coldness. "You have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you know how." And they did exactly that. Matthew says they sealed the stone and left the guard. Sealing the stone meant placing a cord across the entrance of the tomb, fastened at the sides with clay or wax, and stamping that wax with the official seal, probably the seal of the Sanhedrin or the Roman governor himself. Anyone who broke that seal would be committing a crime against Rome. The punishment was death. The Roman guard, called a custodia in Greek, a word borrowed directly from the Latin custodia, was typically composed of 4 to 16 soldiers. These were not mall guards. They were professional soldiers of the most efficient army in the ancient world. A Roman legionnaire carried 30 kilograms of equipment, marched 30 kilometers a day, and was trained to fight in such precise formation that each man protected the shield of the comrade next to him. If a guard slept during his shift, the punishment was being beaten to death by his own colleagues, a practice called fustuarium. And now these men were sitting in front of a tomb, in the dark, watching a corpse. If all of this impressed you, leave a like now so this video can reach more people who need to hear this story. Think of the cosmic irony of this situation. The religious leaders did everything they humanly could to ensure Jesus stayed dead. A 2-ton stone, Rome's official seal, armed professional soldiers. Every layer of security was an involuntary testimony to the power they feared. You do not lock something you believe is truly dead with that much force. You lock something you suspect, even if you refuse to admit it, might not stay where it was placed. While priests planned, soldiers watched, women waited, and disciples hid, there was a third scenario happening, a scenario that no human eye could see. And it is here that Holy Saturday becomes the most mysterious day in the entire biblical narrative. Because the question that defines this day is a question theologians have debated for 2,000 years. Where was Jesus between the cross and the resurrection? The body was in the tomb, that is a fact. But what about the spirit? What happened to the part of Jesus that was not flesh and bone? The Bible gives clues, fragments scattered in different books written by different authors, that when gathered paint a picture that is at once fascinating and terrifying. The first clue is in Jesus' own words on the cross. Luke 23:43. He turns to the crucified thief beside him and says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Today, not tomorrow, not on the third day, today. This means that, at the moment of death, something of Jesus went to a place called paradise. But what was this paradise? In first-century Jewish thought, paradise was not the final heaven. It was a section of Sheol, the world of the dead. The Jews believed that Sheol was divided into compartments. On one side was Abraham's bosom, a place of comfort for the righteous who died. On the other side, separated by an impassable chasm, was the place of torment. Jesus himself described this geography in Luke 16 in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. But that is only the first layer, because there is a second biblical passage that suggests something much more radical than simply resting in Abraham's bosom. And what it describes will completely change your perspective on what happened on that silent Saturday. The passage is in 1 Peter 3:18-20, and it says something that, when you read it slowly, makes the air leave your lungs. Peter writes, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah." Read it again. He went and preached to the spirits in prison. Jesus did not stay sleeping in the tomb. He did not stay still in Abraham's bosom contemplating eternity. He went somewhere, and he did something. The Greek verb used here for preach it is ekarixen, from karisso, which means to proclaim as a herald. It is not the Greek verb for preaching the gospel. It is the verb for making an official announcement, a declaration of authority, like an emissary of a king entering a conquered city and reading a decree. And the recipients of this proclamation are called spirits in prison, beings who were disobedient in the days of Noah. Most scholars identify these spirits with the beings described in Genesis 6:1-4, the sons of God, who, according to ancient Jewish tradition preserved in the book of Enoch, abandoned their celestial position and descended to earth, generating a corruption that led to the flood. According to this tradition, these beings were imprisoned in a place of darkness, chained until the final judgment. And it is to these beings, locked in the cosmic basement for millennia, that Jesus went on that Saturday to make an announcement. What announcement? The Bible does not say explicitly, but the context gives the answer. He did not go to offer them salvation. He did not go to negotiate. He went to declare victory. The herald does not ask for permission. The herald informs of the result. And the result was death lost. The blood on the cross was enough. The plan these beings tried to destroy by corrupting the human lineage before the flood had worked despite everything. The Messiah came, the Messiah died, and the Messiah was standing before them, alive in spirit, announcing that the game was over. Now add this passage to another. Ephesians 4:8-10. Paul writes, "This is why it says, when he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people." What does he ascended mean, except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions? He who descended is the very one who ascended higher than all the heavens, the lower parts of the earth. Paul is saying that before ascending, Jesus descended. He descended to a place that is below. And when he ascended, he took something with him, or someone. He took captivity captive. This phrase is a quote from Psalm 68 and paints the image of a victorious general returning from battle, bringing with him the prisoners who were liberated. Early Christian tradition called this event the descent into Hades, or in later language, the harrowing of hell. It appears in the Apostles' Creed one of the oldest creeds in Christianity, recited in churches worldwide to this day. He was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. On the third day, he rose again from the dead. This phrase was not added by accident. It was included because the first Christians believed that something monumental happened between Friday and Sunday. Something active, something aggressive. Holy Saturday was not the day of God's silence. It was the day of God's invasion. While the body lay motionless in that stone tomb, Jesus' spirit was breaking down the doors of the world of the dead. The Gospel of Nicodemus, a 4th century apocryphal text that compiled much older oral traditions, describes this scene with language that is pure cinematography. It portrays Hades as a fortress, and Jesus' arrival as the moment the gates are torn from their hinges. A voice echoes in the darkness. "Lift up your heads, O gates. Be lifted up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in." It is a direct quote from Psalm 24. And the beings of darkness ask, "Who is this King of glory?" Now yes, this text is not canonical. It is not in the Bible. But it reflects what Christians of the first generations believed happened that day. And the biblical basis for this belief is there, in Peter, in Paul, in the words of Jesus himself. There is an Orthodox icon called Anastasis, the oldest representation of the resurrection in Eastern Christianity, and what it shows is not Jesus coming out of the tomb. What it shows is Jesus standing over the broken doors of Hades, grabbing Adam and Eve by the wrists and pulling them out. Under Jesus' feet, broken chains, destroyed locks, keys scattered on the floor. This is Holy Saturday in the view of the early church, is not silence, it is rescue. But here is the tension that makes this day so theologically unique. None of this was visible. None of this could be perceived by human eyes. On the surface, in the Jerusalem of stone and dust, Saturday remained the quietest day of the week. And nowhere was this contrast between the invisible and the visible more jarring than in one specific place, the temple. Imagine the scene in the temple on that Saturday morning. The priests woke up dressed in their white linen clothes and began the rituals. Because the rituals did not stop, they never stopped. The tamid, the daily sacrifice, was offered every morning and every evening, without exception, including the Sabbath. A 1-year-old lamb without blemish was sacrificed at dawn and another at dusk. Smoke rose from the bronze altar in the outer courtyard, visible from the whole city. But that morning, the priests had a problem that no liturgical manual covered. The temple veil had torn. Matthew records that at the moment of Jesus' death, the veil of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. This veil was not a decorative curtain, it was a massive structure. The Talmud describes the temple veil as being a handbreadth thick, approximately 10 centimeters. It was woven with 72 braided cords, each composed of 24 threads. It was so heavy that according to rabbinic tradition, it would take 300 priests to move it. And this veil separated the Holy of Holies, the place where God's presence dwelt, from the rest of the temple, from top to bottom. The text is specific about the direction of the tear, not from bottom to top, as it would be if human hands had pulled it, from top to bottom, as if something or someone had torn the separation from the inside. And now the priests had to deal with this. What do you do when the veil that no human being should cross, except the high priest, once a year on Yom Kippur, is hanging in strips? The Holy of Holies, the most sacred space in the Jewish universe, was exposed. Any priest who passed nearby could look inside. This was unthinkable. It was as if the spiritual architecture of the universe had split along with that fabric. The biblical texts do not record what the priests did about the torn veil. But liturgical logic requires that some emergency solution was improvised. A temporary curtain, a wooden barrier, something, because the rituals could not stop. especially during Passover, when thousands of additional sacrifices were offered. The system had to keep functioning, even if its centerpiece was destroyed. And that is exactly what makes the scene in the temple on that Saturday so extraordinary. The priests were operating a system that had already been deactivated. They sacrificed lambs while the lamb had already been sacrificed. They offered animal blood while the blood that made that entire system obsolete had already been shed on Golgotha, less than 500 meters away. They burned incense to approach God, while the veil that symbolized the separation between God and humanity lay torn on the floor behind them. But they did not know this, or if they did, they could not admit it, because admitting it meant accepting that everything they had done, the entire priestly structure, the entire temple hierarchy, the entire sacrificial economy that employed thousands of people and generated fortunes, had just become obsolete on a Friday afternoon. No system recognizes its own irrelevance, especially a system that is religious, political, and economic all at once. The temple employed approximately 700 priests, organized in 24 shifts, plus 9,600 Levites. The temple economy moved enormous amounts of money, from the money changers in the outer courts to the animal sellers, from the temple tax collectors to the artisans who maintained the building. It was the nation's largest institution, and on that Saturday, that institution kept functioning as if nothing had happened. Incense rose, prayers were recited, psalms were sung, because that is what the system did. It continued, even when the foundation no longer existed, even when the veil was on the floor. But if the temple was a machine that could not stop, the rest of the city operated on a completely different frequency. And there was one man in Jerusalem who on that Saturday occupied a position perhaps more uncomfortable than any other. His name was Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest. Caiaphas was a skilled politician. He had held the office for over a decade, since 18 AD, which was extraordinary. High priests in the Roman period were changed frequently at the whim of the governor's interests. The fact that Caiaphas survived 4 Roman prefects shows he was a master of the art of balancing Roman demands with Jewish expectations. And it had been Caiaphas who weeks earlier uttered the phrase that sealed Jesus' fate. John 11:49-50 records, "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. One man die for the people." From a political point of view, it was a cold calculation. Jesus was causing agitation. Agitation attracted Roman attention. Roman attention brought repression. Repression could lead to a massacre like those that had happened before. Pilate had already mixed the blood of Galileans with their sacrifices, as Luke 13:1 records. Caiaphas decided it was better sacrifice one to save many. Realpolitik in priestly robes. But now, on that Saturday, with the body in the tomb and the veil torn just a few meters from where he stood, what was going through Caiaphas's mind? Was he at peace with his decision? Or were the earthquake, the 3-hour darkness in the middle of the day, and the inexplicably torn veil eroding from within the certainty he projected on the outside? We do not know. The Bible does not record his thoughts that day. But we know what he did that morning. He went to Pilate to ask for guards for the tomb, and that, in itself, reveals more than any confession. Men who sleep in peace do not ask for armies to guard graves. And then there was Pilate, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, Rome's representative in that corner of the empire. Pilate was already having a terrible week even before Jesus was dragged to his court. His wife, Claudia Procula, according to tradition, had sent him a message in the middle of the trial. "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." Matthew 27:19. The Roman governor received a supernatural warning from his own wife, ignored it, and handed over an innocent man to be crucified after publicly washing his hands. Now it was Saturday, and Pilate was in his praetorium, probably Herod's palace in the upper part of the city, where Roman governors stayed during visits to Jerusalem. He had already dealt with the priest's request for a guard. He had already authorized the soldiers. And now? Now he hoped this story would die, along with the Galilean. Pilate had bigger problems. He had problems with Sejanus in Rome, the powerful Praetorian prefect who was his political patron and who, within a few years, would fall into disgrace. Pilate needed stability in Judea. He needed Passover to end without incident. He needed 300,000 pilgrims to go home without a revolt. The last thing Pilate wanted was a martyr. And on that Friday, he had created exactly that. The darkness that covered the land during the crucifixion could not be ignored. Phlegon of Tralles, a 2nd century Roman historian, recorded an anomalous eclipse and earthquakes around that time. Thallus, another historian, also mentioned the darkness and tried to explain it as a solar eclipse. Although a solar eclipse during the Passover full moon is astronomically impossible. Something happened in the sky that day that was visible enough to enter Roman records, and Pilate saw it, and he could not explain it. But Rome did not rule with explanations. Rome ruled with order. And Pilate's order for that Saturday was simple. Let nothing happen. Let the body stay in the tomb. Let the disciples stay hidden. Let the priests stay satisfied. And let Passover end. If he had known what was about to happen in less than 24 hours, perhaps he would have sent an entire legion to guard that tomb. But he did not know, and it would not have made a difference, because while Pilate calculated, while Caiaphas maneuvered, while soldiers watched and disciples cried, the clock of the universe kept moving towards something that no stone, no seal, no army could contain. The hours of Saturday were passing. The afternoon was arriving. And somewhere in that crowded city, Mary Magdalene was already counting the minutes. But before we reach the end of the day, before the sun begins to descend and Saturday begins to dissolve, we need to talk about an aspect of Holy Saturday that is almost never discussed. An aspect that does not involve people, but a concept. And that concept is the silence of God. Because if you read the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation, Holy Saturday is the only day when God is completely, absolutely, unequivocally silent. No voice from heaven, no angels, no prophecies, no visible miracles, no signs, no nothing. And this silence had a purpose that goes far beyond what it seems. Think about it for a moment. In the Old Testament, God speaks. Constantly. He speaks with Adam in the garden. He speaks with Noah before the flood. He speaks with Abraham under the stars. He speaks with Moses from within a bush that burns and is not consumed. He sends angels, sends dreams, inspires prophets, thunders from Sinai, whispers in gentle breezes. Even in the darkest moments of Israel's history, exile, slavery, famine, there is always a voice. There is always a prophet who stands up and says, "Thus says the Lord." Even the silence between Malachi and John the Baptist, those famous 400 intertestamental years that theologians call the silence of God, was not absolute. There were communities like the Essenes producing apocalyptic texts. There were the Dead Sea Scrolls being written. There was a subterranean spiritual effervescence that fed messianic expectation. But Holy Saturday is different. It is not a silence of centuries simmering underneath. It is a silence of hours that is total, dense, hermetic, like the silence inside a sealed tomb. And this silence creates something that theology rarely has the courage to face, the experience of a universe without God. Not that God had ceased to exist, but from the point of view of any human being alive on that Saturday, it was as if he had withdrawn completely. The disciples did not hear his voice. The temple worked on autopilot. The sky was mute. And the only man who in the last 3 years had been the palpable, visible, touchable presence of God on earth. "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father," he had said in John 14:9. That man was dead. wrapped in linen, locked behind a stone, guarded by soldiers who did not even know what they were guarding. There is a German expression that theologians use to describe this moment, Karsamstag, literally, the Saturday of Lamentation. And the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, centuries later, when he wrote his famous phrase, "God is dead," without knowing it, was describing exactly what the disciples felt on that specific day. For them, on that Saturday, God really was dead. The difference is that Nietzsche turned a day into a philosophy. The disciples had to live that day without knowing it was just a day. And here is what is almost never said about this silence. It was necessary, not as a dramatic pause, not as a narrative device so that the resurrection would be more impactful. It was necessary for a precise theological reason. Because if the resurrection had happened immediately, if Jesus had died on the cross at 3 on Friday afternoon and risen at 3:30, death would not have been real. It would have been a trick, a demonstration, a quick dip that does not get you wet. For the victory over death to be complete, death needed to be experienced in full, not bypassed, not shortened, lived. Jesus did not touch the surface of death and return. He went to the bottom. He stayed there. The body cooled. Rigor mortis stiffened the muscles. Decomposition began its microscopic work. The bacteria of the intestinal tract, without the immune system to contain them, began to spread through the tissues. This is the detail that no one wants to mention, but that matters deeply. Jesus' death was biologically complete. Every second that passed in that tomb was a real second of real death. And the entire Saturday, all those hours, was the time necessary so that there would be no doubt, so that there would be no escape, so that death could sink its claws in completely and still lose, because that is exactly what makes the resurrection what it is. It is not a man who escaped death at the last second. It is a man whom death swallowed completely and could not digest. And the silence of Saturday is the sound of death trying. It is the sound of the grave doing its work. It is the sound of darkness thinking it won, while in reality something was growing in the dark, something that darkness did not have the vocabulary to describe. But God's silence on that Saturday also works on another level, a level that is not theological but deeply human, because Saturday is the day when Jesus' followers were forced to exist without answers, without explanation, without a visible promise that things would be okay. And this experience, this suspension in the void between catastrophe and redemption, is an experience that millions of people throughout history have known intimately. We all have our holy Saturdays, the day after the diagnosis and before the biopsy result, the day after the layoff and before the next job, the day after the funeral and before discovering how to keep living. Saturday is the day you wake up and the world is still broken and God has explained nothing, and perhaps that is why Holy Saturday is the most ignored day of Holy Week. Good Friday has drama. The cross, the blood, the darkness, the earthquake. Easter Sunday has triumph, the empty tomb, the angels, the appearance in the garden. But Saturday has only waiting, and no one wants to preach about waiting. No one holds a celebration service for uncertainty. But it is on Saturday that most of us live, not in the drama of Friday, not in the triumph of Sunday, in the silence of the in-between, in the not yet. And what Holy Saturday teaches is that God's silence is not God's absence. It is that sometimes, at the moment when it seems like nothing is happening, that is when everything is happening, only at a level our eyes do not reach and our ears do not catch. But let us return to Jerusalem. Because while the concept of God's silence unfolds in theological layers, the hours of Saturday were passing in a very concrete way. And as the afternoon progressed, something began to change in the city. The sun descended a little more. Shadows lengthened in the narrow alleys. And in various houses scattered throughout Jerusalem and its surroundings, a specific group of people began to move with a silent purpose. the women. Mark 16:1 says that Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Luke adds that the women prepared spices and perfumes. This preparation could not have happened on Saturday. Buying and manual labor were forbidden. So the chronology tells us something important. Some scholars propose that the purchase happened on Friday before sunset, in the narrow interval between the descent from the cross and the start of the Sabbath. Others argue that the purchase happened on Saturday night, after the first 3 stars appeared in the sky and the Sabbath officially ended. In any case, at some point between the end of Saturday and the early hours of Sunday, these women were in motion, buying myrrh, buying aloes, mixing oils, preparing linen strips, and doing all of this with an efficiency that suggests that, while the men were paralyzed with fear behind locked doors, the women were already planning. What they intended to do was complete the funeral ritual that Friday's haste had prevented. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus had done an emergency preparation. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes weighing about 34 kilograms, according to John 19:39, which was a royal amount. But the full process of anointing and wrapping had not been finalized before sunset. The women wanted to finish the job. They wanted to give Jesus the dignified funeral treatment he deserved. And this detail reveals something about their emotional state that is different from the state of the male disciples. The men were in collapse. Peter, who had denied Jesus 3 times, probably could not even look at himself in the mirror. The others had fled Gethsemane running, one of them so desperately that he left behind the clothes he was wearing and went out naked into the night, as Mark 14:51-52 records. John was taking care of Mary, Jesus' mother, as Jesus asked from the cross. Thomas had disappeared completely, but the women were planning a trip to the tomb at dawn. This meant they were willing to leave the house in the darkness, walk through the streets of a hostile city, pass by Roman guards, and handle the body of a man executed by Rome as a political criminal. This was dangerous. It was not a devotional stroll. Any public association with Jesus at that moment was a real risk, and they knew it, and they went anyway. Mark records that the only logistical concern they expressed was, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb for us?" Mark 16:3. Not what if the guards arrest us, not what if we are seen and denounced, just the stone, the practical obstacle. As if fear were a luxury they could not afford, because there was work to be done. There was a body that needed to be cared for, with dignity. And in first-century Jewish culture, caring for the dead was one of the most sacred obligations, called chesed shel emet, the kindness of truth. The purest kindness that exists because it is done for someone who can never pay it back. And here is an irony that cuts deep. The women were preparing to anoint a dead body. They were taking spices to fight the smell of decomposition. They were preparing for a final act of farewell, the last touch, the last care, the last gesture of love before moving away from the tomb and accepting that everything was over. They were not going to the tomb expecting a miracle. They're going to the tomb to say goodbye. And that is the detail that makes what happened next so devastatingly unexpected. They were not surprised in the middle of a prayer vigil. They were not found in mystical ecstasy waiting for the resurrection. They were surprised with jars of perfume in their hands and tears on their faces, doing the most mundane and most human thing one can do, caring for someone who died. Their faith was not the faith that expects the impossible. It was the faith that keeps showing up even when it believes everything is lost. But the women were not the only ones who spent that Saturday in a significant way. There were 2 figures that the biblical narrative almost forgets on Holy Saturday, but who deserve attention: Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. These 2 men formed an unlikely pair. Joseph was a member of the Sanhedrin, the same council that condemned Jesus, described by Mark as someone who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God. Luke adds that he had not consented to their decision and action against Jesus. Nicodemus was a Pharisee, the one who had gone to visit Jesus at night at the beginning of his ministry for fear of being seen. The famous conversation of John 3 about being born again. These two men had something in common. They were secret disciples, followers of Jesus, who had kept their loyalty hidden for fear of the political consequences. And then on Friday, when all the public disciples fled, it was the secret disciples who appeared. Joseph went to Pilate to ask for the body, an act of extraordinary courage that identified him publicly as an associate of Jesus. Nicodemus brought the spices, a considerable expense and a gesture impossible to hide. The two took the body, wrapped it in linen, and placed it in Joseph's new tomb. And then came Saturday, and these two men woke up in a Jerusalem that now knew who they were. Their cover was blown. The anonymity that protected them for months or years had evaporated in one afternoon. The entire Sanhedrin knew Joseph had asked for the body. Everyone who saw the funeral procession knew Nicodemus was there. They had declared themselves. They had chosen a side, and the side they had chosen was that of the executed man who was now in a tomb. There is no biblical record of what Joseph and Nicodemus did on that Saturday. But think of their position. Joseph was a member of the council that condemned Jesus, and now he had buried Jesus with honors. This was, in practice, a public vote of dissent, an act of open defiance to the rest of the Sanhedrin. Nicodemus was a respected Pharisee who had just spent a fortune on spices for a man his colleagues considered a blasphemer. On that Saturday, both were probably making calculations similar to Pilate's, but in the opposite direction. Pilate calculated how to maintain order. Joseph and Nicodemus calculated the cost of what they had done and if they were ready to pay the price. Because the next morning, when the sun rose, they would still be the men who buried Jesus. There was no going back. And there was another person in that city whose experience of Saturday is perhaps the most painful of all, although the Gospels mention her only in passing. Mary, the mother. She had stood by the cross until the end. John places Mary there, standing, not fainted, not being carried, standing, while the nails held her son to the wood. And there, with her vision blurred by tears and her ears full of sounds no mother should ever hear, she heard Jesus say to John, "Behold your mother." Now on that Saturday, Mary was at John's house. And what can be said about the pain of a mother who buried her son? What words are big enough? Mary had stored things in her heart before. Luke says that when the shepherds came to see the baby in Bethlehem, Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. When Simeon in the temple prophesied that a sword will pierce your own soul, Luke 2:35, she stored that too. 33 years of stored things, 33 years of signs, wonders, fears and marvels, all stored in that heart. And now on that Saturday, Simeon's sword had finally arrived. And it was worse than any prophecy could have prepared her for. Catholic tradition calls Mary at this moment Mater Dolorosa, the mother of sorrows. And there is a medieval prayer called Stabat Mater, the mother was standing, that tries to capture this moment. At the cross, her station keeping, stood the mournful mother weeping, close to her son to the last. But even this poetry, with all its beauty, cannot touch the bottom of what that Saturday meant to her. Because Mary knew things the other disciples did not know. She knew about the angel Gabriel. She knew about the virginal conception. She knew about the prophecies of Simeon and Anna. She knew that the boy who learned to walk in Nazareth, who worked in Joseph's workshop, who played in the hills of Galilee, was not just her son. He was the son. And now this son was dead. And she was sitting in a borrowed house, in a city that killed him, waiting for a dawn that, as far as she knew, would bring only another day without him. The shadows continued to lengthen. The sun touched the horizon to the west behind the hills, painting the Jerusalem sky orange and then purple. And when the first 3 stars appeared, the traditional sign that a new day had begun in the Jewish calendar, Holy Saturday ended. Officially, it was now the first day of the week, what Christians would later call Sunday. And with the end of Saturday, certain restrictions fell away. The women could now buy what was missing, prepare what they needed, and plan the walk to the tomb in the early hours of the morning. The city began to move again. Lamps were lit, doors were opened. The smell of spices being mixed came from houses where female hands worked in silence. But the darkness that fell that night over Jerusalem was not an ordinary darkness. It was the last darkness. The final hours before the world changed forever. And no one in the city, no priest, no soldier, no disciple, no woman with myrrh in her hands had the slightest idea of what was to come. The Roman guards by the tomb pulled their cloaks tight against the night cold. April in Jerusalem, at an altitude of 750 meters, could be freezing after sunset. Temperatures dropped to 8 or 9 degrees Celsius. These soldiers were probably a temple guard or a small Roman detachment. The Greek text in Matthew uses custodian, a transliteration of the Latin custodia, suggesting Roman soldiers. 4 men, perhaps more, alternating shifts with clear orders. No one touches this tomb. The seal they had placed on the stone was an official cord, fastened with wax and marked with the signet of Rome. Breaking this seal was a crime against the empire. The punishment was severe. And so, in the darkness of that night, these soldiers stood guard against the possibility the priests had presented to Pilate that the disciples would come to steal the body and claim a resurrection. It is almost comical when you think about it. The disciples could not even leave the house. Peter was destroyed by guilt. The others were paralyzed by fear. No one was planning night operations to steal a corpse from inside a sealed tomb guarded by professional soldiers. But Caiaphas and the priests projected onto the disciples the audacity they themselves would have had in that situation. And they sent guards. And these guards, without knowing it, were about to become the first witnesses of the most important event in human history. Not the disciples, not the women, not the faithful followers who spent Saturday crying and praying. The first to see were pagan soldiers who were there to prevent exactly what was about to happen. The hours dragged on. Midnight, 1 in the morning, 2, 3. The city slept. The Passover pilgrims slept, piled in houses and camps. The priests slept in their quarters near the temple. Pilate slept, or did not sleep, in his palace. The disciples slept, or did not sleep, behind their locked doors. Mary perhaps did not sleep at all. The women perhaps slept little, with the spices already prepared by the door, ready to leave as soon as there was enough light to walk. And the guards by the tomb fought against sleep, because sleeping on duty in the Roman guard was punishable by death. The entire world was suspended, like the moment between inhaling and exhaling, like the silence between lightning and thunder, like the fraction of a second between the seed cracking under the earth and the sprout piercing the surface.
Good Light TV. Step into the light. Good Light